Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for showing up for this special briefing today. My name is Peter Mulrean. I am the director of the UNRWA Representative Office here in New York, and it is my great pleasure to be with you today with two of our field directors from UNRWA. We have, to my right, Gwyn, who is the director of UNRWA operations in the West Bank. Gwyn has been with UNRWA this time since 2016, also has worked for other UN agencies as well as NGOs in the region and in humanitarian operations in the past, before taking over as the director in the West Bank at the beginning of this year. She was the deputy director of our field operations in Lebanon. Matthias Schmale has been with UNRWA since 2015. He is currently the director of UNRWA field operations in Gaza. Before that, he was actually in my current job in New York, and prior to that, he was the director of operations in Lebanon and with the International Federation of the Red Cross and other organizations prior to that. So we are very lucky to have them here today to be able to provide us a view of the situation on the ground. Just to review for you quickly, UNRWA, as I'm sure all of you know, is the UN agency tasked with providing assistance to Palestine refugees, of which there are currently 5.4 million, and that assistance is to be provided until a just and lasting solution is found to the refugees' plight. UNRWA operates in 5 areas, the West Bank and Gaza, in addition to Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. As many of you are aware, over the last year and a half, UNRWA has been facing a financial crisis after a decision by the U.S. at the beginning of 2018 to end its funding of UNRWA. We were able to overcome that crisis in 2019, a $446 million shortfall that we faced in 2018, that through the generosity of the international community, both large donors and small, we got that shortfall down to 0 by the end of 2018. 2019, we've presented a budget requesting exactly the amount that we received in 2018, which is $1.2 billion. And I would stress that that's less than we asked for in 2018, but it's what we actually got, in addition to which UNRWA has been undertaking serious internal cost control measures to ensure that we are playing our part in facing this financial difficulty. Last year, for example, we saved $92 million internally in savings. So I raise the funding question right now as it is pertinent for 2 reasons. One is that while we have received early contributions from a number of our donors, we will be running into a financial shortage situation by the end of June again if we do not receive additional contributions. And 2, because that timing coincides with UNRWA's annual pledging conference, which will take place here in New York on the 25th of June. The Secretary General will be opening the conference again as a display of his continued support for UNRWA, to which he attaches great humanitarian and political and security significance. But when we talk about financial shortfalls and the impact, what we really need to talk about is what is the effect that it's having on the refugees themselves on the ground. So I will, at this point, turn it over to Matthias and Gwyn and ask them, perhaps starting with Gwyn, to outline for us some of the challenges that they are facing on a day-to-day basis in the West Bank and in Gaza. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you all again for coming. Maybe just to start by saying that the West Bank obviously is a very different context from some of the other fields, and so each of our operations has its own challenges. The context in the West Bank is that we have 830,000 refugees, Palestinian refugees, out of a population of 2.8 million overall. We manage services, education, health, relief and social services, sanitation for those refugees. 30% of them live across 19 camps in the West Bank, and the others live in other areas of the West Bank. In terms of the challenges in the West Bank, the biggest issue that we are facing is really linked to the occupation and the presence of the barrier and over 600 closures and obstacles across the West Bank that separate the Palestinian population from Israel, but also from the settlers living in the West Bank. There's over 500,000 settlers now living inside the West Bank. And as a result of that, there is a very heavy presence of the Israeli military inside the West Bank. Last year, for example, we had over 7,000 incursions by the Israeli security forces into the West Bank. That means about 19 military operations inside the territory a day, or for the camps in particular, that's twice a day. So for the residents of the camps, that means heavily armed soldiers entering their camps, very densely populated communities, a very high use of live ammunition. We have very high rates of injuries from live ammunition and heavy use of tear gas. There's double amount of tear gas usage in the camps in the West Bank than in the rest of the West Bank. Most of these operations are search and arrest campaigns looking for people that the Israeli security forces want to arrest. But because of the methods used, it has a very, very high impact on the civilian population. And we have issues in terms of injuries of children by live ammunition. Tear gas is non-discriminatory. It enters everybody's houses when it's used. And because the camps are so densely populated, this has a huge impact, particularly on children. A couple of weeks ago, we had a baby who nearly died from tear gas inhalation in their home at night. We also are seeing very high rates of child detention, and as a result of that, there are a lot of psychosocial pressures and challenges on children, and we need to run programs to reintegrate children back into the schools after the detention. So the day-to-day life is very heavy, difficult, a very coercive environment, and the tensions between the settlers and the local populations are ongoing. I think despite that, we have been lucky in that we've been able to maintain some of our services, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later. But really, some of the most critical projects that we have at the moment are really under threat because of the financial situation. And in particular, I mean the protection components, which really are about reintegrating some of the child detainees, as I've already mentioned, but also teaching our staff how to manage tear gas canisters, how to deal with some of the violence, and also to advocate and engage with the Israeli security forces to try and mitigate some of the impact on the civilian population. So that's also really where some of this critical funding is going. Maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you, Peter. My answer to the question, what are the main challenges, would be, I can think of three key ones. The first one is avoiding war and coping with military escalation. So you will all remember in early May we had 48 hours of war. We were not close to war, we were in war for 48 hours. The number of rockets and missiles flying back and forth exceeded the daily average of 2014. You will remember there were 25 people killed on the Gaza side and 4 on the Israeli side, buildings destroyed, etc. So for all intents and purposes, that was war. And it's the fifth time there was a military escalation since I started a bit more than a year and a half ago. So really, Gaza is constantly on edge, and this is one of the challenges. How do we cope with these fairly frequent military escalations? It leads me to the second challenge, which is coping with what my medical staff, health staff in Gaza call a psychosocial epidemic. During these 48 hours, I heard in particular children and elderly people scream every time there was an explosion. And it was very clear that the accumulated traumas of 3 wars were coming back to people very rapidly. Added to this is what's been happening in the context of what is called the Great March of Return at the fence, as people refer to it on the Gaza side. You will know perhaps that over the year or so that those have been taking place, mostly on Fridays, a staggering 30,000 people have been injured, 7,000 with live ammunition, many of them having to cope now with lifelong disabilities. 200 people killed, including 13 children, at least 13 children who went to UNRWA schools. So that obviously has a serious psychosocial impact. I remember vividly where about 8 months ago or so, seeing a picture a colleague sent me from one of our 274 schools where on a Thursday the class was complete, and then on Friday one of the class members, a boy, was killed, and on Saturday they put up a big photo of him on his seat. A boy they had played with 2 days earlier was gone. And it clearly, when you talk to our education staff, they are very much increasingly talking about having to cope with children and their psychosocial issues. And then finally, a challenge is maintaining hopes for the future. With all this bleakness, how do you maintain hopes for the future? And I guess we'll come back to that, Peter, but basic services such as education and keeping people healthy are a big part of that.
Thank you both very much. Actually, let's come back to that right now, because I think the good news story out of last year was, despite both the financial challenges and the challenges faced on the ground, UNRWA was able to maintain its primary services. As you mentioned, we're talking about 711 schools for 536,000 children, boys and girls, across the 5 areas, 140 clinics with 8 million patient visits a year. The scale of this is tremendous when you think of it, but you underscored how difficult the life can be. But I'd like to have the opportunity to hear also what is accomplished despite all of these challenges, and what you see as the positive results coming out of maintaining these operations.
There are a lot of positives, because I think what UNRWA does is we provide an integrated set of services, and that's really important because it really supports the whole social fabric of the communities that we work with. One of the critical services for the West Bank, as in the other fields, is obviously education. But what makes it particularly important in the West Bank is also just the fact that we can, within our schools, provide an environment that is violence-free. And we do that through how our courses are taught, through human rights and conflict resolution, also through the tolerance that's promoted through the curricula, and these are all United Nations values. But it also provides a safe space for children, and we do a lot of after-school activities, reintegration of children that were detained, and so a huge emphasis on supporting children who are living very often in a very violent context, that are coming in contact with settlers themselves, that may save the army in their communities, may be exposed to tear gas or hear live ammunition, all have family members that have been hurt, arrested or injured at one time or another. So really providing that in our 94 schools in the West Bank is really critical to maintaining the support to the young generation. And I think what's also important to highlight is since the 1960s, we have gender parity in our schools. So we're providing some of the best education that's available in the Middle East. We've been assessed and a lot of our programs critically looked at. So in addition to that education service, providing that safe environment for children is really important.
I can mirror exactly what Gwyn has talked about. You will find in all our 5 fields these basic services around education and health. In particular, in Gaza, we run 274 schools, which have almost 280,000 children in them. And, it's the basic education is complemented exactly with the kinds of activities that Gwyn's already described around human rights curriculum, but also just having fun. So, for example, we have a very good collaboration with the British Council and a British NGO called Hands Up that is teaching children how to write plays and then act them out and film them. And, it's pretty amazing what in the context of 12 years of blockade children come up with in terms of very positive plays. There are also some very depressing ones reflecting their reality, but also some that express their hopes and dreams for the future. I try to frequently visit our schools and attend events, and one thing that always resonates with children and teaching staff and parents is Mandela's famous words around education is the most powerful weapon to fight poverty and inequality. I really think that holds very much in the context of Gaza. Perhaps one thing to add in the context of Gaza to what Gwyn has described as the core services, and I've tried to say as well, is food. Sadly, provision of food. Sadly, in Gaza, we now have 80% of the Palestine refugees registered with UNRWA. That amounts to about a bit more than 1 million people dependent on food aid from us. So every quarter we run a massive food security operation. And of course that keeps hopes alive as well. It's preventative humanitarian action. We're not responding to hunger. We're trying to prevent hunger. So that's a complement in the specific context of Gaza to our core services.
Great, thanks. Before we turn to questions from the journalists, I thought something that came through in what both of you were talking about was sort of the scale on which UNRWA is working, the numbers, the fact that UNRWA is not a typical assistance provider in that it is a direct service provider. UNRWA hires the teachers are themselves working in the camps. The medical staff is ours, the clinics we build, et cetera. And so I guess from your perspective on the ground, what does that mean, particularly in this tense situation that you've described, running such a complex and large operation and the impact that has on the communities where you're working?
You're absolutely. I think you have to. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think the scale is quite incredible, and I think as we've touched on already, it really impacts many facets of the lives of people. One thing that I'm always impressed by is our sanitation labourers. We have a number of sanitation labourers that work in the camps that collect the garbage every day, go through very narrow alleyways, collect the garbage, and we have a very sophisticated system. And when we were facing the financial crisis last year, that was one of the key concerns of the community, not only about keeping the schools open and the health centres open, but just those basic services. What would happen if UNRWA was not able to hire people? So it's not only because we have so many staff, we also are one of the, I think in the West Bank, we're the second largest employer because we also hire people who are refugees working for UNRWA. 95% of our staff are Palestinian refugees themselves. So that helps supports their families, helps supports the services. So it really has a very profound effect. And there is a heavy reliance on UNRWA because of our decades of experience working in all of the 5 fields. I think we really have a value added in terms of expertise, in terms of experience and knowledge. And because the programs are managed by the local staff themselves, they really are adapted to the needs of the communities.
Around the scale issue in Gaza, which has a population of roughly 2 million people, 1.4 million of them are registered with UNRWA as Palestine refugees. So we provide the services we've been talking about to at least 70% of the population in Gaza, which makes us really a key actor in the Gaza context. Gwyn has talked about the importance of employment. We employ in Gaza 13,000 people. Some people will say, a typical UN big bureaucracy. These are not people sitting behind desks. It's 9,000 teachers. Our service is teachers teaching children UN values and other important things. It's 1,000 doctors and nurses keeping the population healthy. So by far the majority of our staff are service providers. As Gwyn talked about, if you take an average of 5 per family or something as a conservative average, and then people in extended families, you can safely say that 100,000 people in Gaza at least depend on UNRWA salaries for a living. So we are indeed that way also a key provider. And maybe the final point to make is, if you run 274 schools, as I said, there is a large number of staff involved in that, but you can also then ask yourself, is there an alternative to that? And I think when you run operations to that scale, providing food to 1 million people, running schools of that magnitude, and health centers, 22 of them providing key primary health care, it's hard to see where the alternative would be in Gaza. There might be others who might want to run UNRWA services, but I'm not sure that would be in anyone's interest.
Well, thank you, and I'd like to open it up to the floor, please.
Yes, I welcome you on behalf of the UN Correspondents Association. I'm Evelyn Leopold, and can you comment on the Bahrain conference that the U.S. is organizing, if any of this works? And that's a big if. Is this not money that the UNRWA seeks to raise that would be best given to UNRWA? And then the two-state solution seems dead, despite lip service paid to us. How does that impact on your activities?
Shall we take maybe a couple more and then?
Answer one at a time.
Oh, if you prefer. Let me start off with the question on Bahrain, which though we don't have a formal position on Bahrain, other than to say that we don't see this as any way in direct competition with what UNRWA does, or even for the funding that UNRWA is seeking. What you're talking about, on the one hand, is a workshop to discuss ideas about potential future economic cooperation. On the other hand, we at our June 25 pledging conference will be talking about finding funding for ongoing operations that are on the ground developed. This isn't some potential issue in the future. This is, there's a lot of talk about what is reality. Well, this is our reality for UNRWA. We have schools to run, we have clinics to open, we have people to feed. And so, just to get a little bit into the second part of your question, the UN still believes, and the Secretary General has made it clear on many occasions, that there is no alternative to the two-state solution. And we believe that the agreed parameters at the UN continue to be the best basis for moving forward. And for those who participate in Bahrain, who also continue to believe in those parameters, well, then we don't think that they should see this as an either-or situation, that the best way to demonstrate that support for those parameters is to continue to support UNRWA both financially and politically.
Thank you, Peter. In terms of the second question on the two-state solution, what we've tried to, I think, in the first part get across to you is what our day job looks like. A big part of it is interacting with refugees and staff. And as Gwyn, I think, mentioned, 95% of our staff are Palestinians, Palestine refugees themselves. Now, what we can reflect back to you is that there, especially among the younger generation, there's a healthy skeptical view of the so-called two-state solution. What I think is important and what I would like to get across is not my position on the two-state solution or a UN position, but we need to take on board, I think, as an international community, that what in particular younger generations are talking about is dignity and rights. It's not a construct of a state that is primarily in the focus of their thinking and their discussions when they talk about the future. When they talk about the future, they want to, first of all, not be hungry. They want to have an education and be healthy, and they want to be able to make use of that education in the form of dignified employment opportunities, and they want dignified ways of exercising political rights such as voting and so on. So that's the narrative of young people, and I think if we want to look to the future, and increasingly elderly generations as well, I think as an international community, that's what we need to look at. What do the people themselves, where are they in their journey?
Thank you. My name is Ali Barada. I'm with the Sharq Al-Awsat newspaper and with France 24. Last week, or just before, Mr. Jason Greenblatt said that the UNRWA should be closed down because it's useless and it's affecting negatively the efforts for the peace, for achieving peace in the Middle East. And in fact, also Israel is saying repeatedly that the UNRWA schools in Gaza and other places are being used for incitements against Israel, or for even being used as a launch pad for rockets against Israel. How do you respond to those allegations? Thanks.
Well, let me take a first cut at that and then can pass to both of you on it. In the general comments that you refer to, that the U.S. Special Envoy stated in the Security Council almost 2 weeks ago now, I think the actual critiques that he listed out were not new to us. We've heard this over the last year and a half from the U.S., and I believe the UNRWA Commissioner General addressed effectively each of these critiques during the Security Council discussion. And so 2 things I would say about it. First is we all listen very carefully, and you too, apparently, to what Mr. Greenblatt said, but I hope everyone listened as carefully to what the other 14 members of the Security Council said, because to say that they did not agree with his critiques is an understatement. There were unanimous expressions of support, some of them very strong support about the quality of the work of UNRWA, the continued importance of this, both for the humanitarian reasons as well as for regional stability, and the need for UNRWA to continue its operations until there is an overall peace agreement. So I think in the general terms, we've heard the U.S. comments. We've heard them before. We have responded to them. But I think the most important thing is to hear what others are saying about UNRWA. Perhaps on the questions of the other question.
Well, a couple of additional thoughts. I think we tried to already earlier, both of us, comment on what goes on in our schools. You know, I personally fail to see how educating at the moment the 280,000 children in our schools in Gaza is a problem for anyone, especially if you then experience the reality of it. Reality is a word frequently used also by certain interlocutors. The reality in Gaza is, as is in the West Bank and the other fields, that we try to ensure that our teaching personnel, our teachers, transmit also UN values around peace and not hating others. Now, I visit our schools very regularly. And, you know, unsurprisingly, in the context of a blockade and what goes on, you will find a student or two who has a certain narrative. By far the majority I meet of both children and teachers and parents are peace-loving people. They want a dignified future. You know, so anyone who suggests, as has been the case and was in your question, that schools in Gaza are schools for terrorism are on the wrong track. That is not the reality I experience on the ground. And I want to repeat, I think, providing children with education instead of having them hang around on the streets or at home or going to someone else's schools, I fail to see how that can be an obstacle to peace. Keeping people healthy and with a perspective for the future, I fail to see how that can be an obstacle for peace.
Yeah, maybe just an additional point, and it links back to the question also about Bahrain. I mean, the Bahrain conference, as Peter has already mentioned, is an economic conference, but economic development requires an educated population. It requires young people who can look at going to technical vocational training, which is some of the services we provide, go to university, and are entrepreneurs who can take advantage of economic opportunities that are offered. So it doesn't also equate that UNRWA services are not needed, but economic development is needed. There seems to be a profound contradiction, and UNRWA is fundamentally a humanitarian organization that was established by a General Assembly resolution. It is not a political organization, and it's been conflated with somehow resolving the conflict if we get rid of UNRWA. So there's a lack of coherence in some of these arguments that are being made.
James Rannell with Middle East Eye. I'm going to ask you again about some of the comments from Mr. Greenblatt. I think the argument that they seem to be presenting is that the services that UNRWA provides can be shifted over. I don't think they're saying that education doesn't need to happen and there doesn't need to be other things for the Palestinian people and refugees, but it can be supplanted and then it can be changed, and that's what they're going to be looking for in Bahrain. If they came up with something workable, would you guys resist it?
Well, I think, as Commissioner General Cranberry said during the Security Council hearing, you're addressing that question to the wrong person, because it's not UNRWA that determines what its mandate is, what it is tasked to do. It is the General Assembly that determines that. So I hear what you're saying. I'd have two comments about it. One is, I think, as we've been hearing from what Matthias and Gwyn are saying, transitioning is not that easy to begin with in just very practical terms when you're talking about something on the scale with the infrastructure, expertise, and everything else that comes with it involved. So it's one shouldn't be glib about just talking about a transition. But the second thing is that I think what struck me during the Security Council meeting was the critiques were not new, but it was a statement that there is no need to wait until there is a peace agreement before beginning this transition. And that's where I would say, for that should not be a question for UNRWA. We are an executive arm of the United Nations. We have been tasked with providing assistance until a just and lasting solution has been found. That is defined as a comprehensive peace agreement that both sides agree on. We will continue executing that role to the best of our ability until the General Assembly tells us to do otherwise. So I think if that argument is to be made, it is, there are things that are in UNRWA's power to adjust how we do certain programs and operationally, but there are other things that are not within our power to adjust, and that is something that has to be decided collectively by the international community. Please.
Hi, my name is Ibtisam Azim from the Daily Arabic Al Arab Al Jadid newspaper. I have a couple of questions. First of all, regarding Jerusalem and the West Bank. Could you talk about your activities in Jerusalem? And then regarding settlers and settler aggression, could you describe more what is happening, how this affects specifically Palestinian farmers and how it looks like on the ground? And on Gaza, you talked about 30,000 Palestinians injured, and about 7,000 of them were injured with live ammunition. To which extent you are able to get, I assume that a lot of them don't get the treatment they need in Gaza because the hospitals don't have probably all. What about treating them in Israeli hospitals? Do you get permissions? And why there is a high number of amputation? Can you say more regarding the weapons are used? And thank you.
When I speak about the West Bank, it includes East Jerusalem, so we provide the same activities and the same services in East Jerusalem as in the rest of the West Bank. There are two camps in particular in East Jerusalem. One is Kalandia camp and the other one is Shofat camp. But we also provide services to the Palestinian refugees that are living in East Jerusalem. That includes schooling, that includes health services, social services, and sanitation, as already mentioned. I think there are other challenges in East Jerusalem at the moment, which includes increased levels of home demolitions in East Jerusalem. And we've seen more home demolitions in East Jerusalem at the beginning of this year than all of last year. So there is a pressure as well on the communities inside East Jerusalem. The camps, Kalandia and Shofat, now have been cut off from the city, even though they're within the municipal boundary lines by the wall. So East Jerusalem residents living in the camps have to cross through checkpoints every day to get into the city, even though many of them are East Jerusalem permit holders and residents. So there are a lot of economic challenges as well as daily challenges in terms of accessing parts of the city, including the holy sites. And we are seeing increasing restrictions and pressures there. Because the Palestinian refugees are refugees, most of them don't own land, so they're living in, that's why many live in camps still. Those that do face the challenges that all Palestinian farmers face, which is linked to confiscation of land. Large tracts of land have been confiscated to build the wall. And also to expand the settlements across the West Bank. They're close to 200 settlements now in the West Bank. Because of the restriction on movement and closures, people have challenges accessing their land. Much land was confiscated on the other side of the wall, so the wall is not exactly built on the 1967 boundary lines. And then there are other issues in terms of trade with Israel or outside Israel. There's a back-to-back system. You have to offload your vegetables or your fruit or your products and then load it back onto an Israeli truck. So there is delays and loss of goods and livelihood. So it really is a challenge, I think, to many small farmers in particular in the West Bank.
Thank you. Allow me, Peter, just a quick afterthought on the previous question. As I mentioned, I visit our schools regularly. I've been in at least 10 schools that have at the entrance a plaque said "built with U.S. money." And what I ask myself is, why not protect the investments made in a decades-long fruitful partnership? As long as there's no alternative, why fix something that's not broken? And there is no real answer to that question. The question is not what's the alternative, but is the current stuff we're doing a success story, and has it been built actually with massive US and other international investments, and why not protect that? On your question, I first need to clarify, UNRWA doesn't run hospitals. We are not involved in secondary or tertiary care. We run primary health care. So our main involvement with the injuries of the Great March has been aftercare, so, dressing, changing dressings, this kind of stuff, physiotherapy, as well as psychological support. I do know, of course, from colleagues who directly deal with the severe injuries, whether it's MSF, the ICRC, the World Health Organization, or the Ministry of Health, how desperate the situation is in terms of totally insufficient capacities inside Gaza to deal with the more severe injuries. It's very clear from what they tell me that the most serious cases do need to be treated elsewhere because the capacities are not in Gaza. There's been very limited success in getting permits to get them out. And, let's remember this is happening in the context where you can find the exact statistics from the World Health Organization that on a monthly basis publishes statistics. I think the last month it was 40% of the permits for medical treatment needed outside Gaza were denied. And that includes, for example, women living with cancer. I had a week ago a colleague of mine in my office in tears because one of his sisters, 53 years old, who has cancer and who depends on treatment in the West Bank, all of a sudden was denied a permit. So it's a very haphazard regime of permits. But the answer to your question is yes, we need more openness to get permits for treatment. And the hospitals we're talking about are mainly West Bank, it's Jordan, it's Turkey. I don't think Israel is very open at this point to treating injuries from the Great March.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Sylviane Zehil from L'Orient Le Jour, Beirut. My question goes to Madame Gwyn and yourself, Mr. Matthias. You have been to Lebanon. You know very well what's going on. Could you please describe a bit the reality on the ground and what kind of challenges you met there and you continue to meet, especially after the stopping of the funding, U.S. funding? And what do you expect to achieve now? Especially we have so many refugees, more than 1.5 million Syrian refugees. Do you think that UNRWA can continue to achieve their goal?
So, thank you. Before moving to the West Bank, I was working in Lebanon. I think there are real challenges for the Palestinian refugees in the country. The majority of the refugees live in the 12 camps, and one of the biggest difficulties they face is really around economics and jobs. And because Lebanon, because of issues of reciprocity, does not allow Palestinian refugees to work as engineers or architects or doctors, or there's a range of professions Palestinian refugees are not allowed to work in. And refugees are not allowed to own property in Lebanon. It really makes the economic situation in the camps a lot more dire than maybe you would see in some of the other fields. And I think that, combined with the very heavy presence and challenges of having over 1 million refugees in the country from Syria, has meant that the informal job sector is even under more pressure, and there's more needs than ever before. We were able to sustain our services last year. We did make cuts in Lebanon as well. We weren't able to recruit all of the staff that we needed, and there were real challenges in terms of keeping the programs going. But we did manage, despite the fact that we've increased the number of children in the classroom, despite the fact that there's more patients per doctor. Given the level of the very high dependence on UNRWA in the camps and the importance for Palestinian refugees, we're really determined to continue our services in Lebanon. It's absolutely essential until there is a broader political solution found.
Thank you.
Matthias from TV2 Norway. I was wondering, did you have to make any specific cuts either in services or jobs last year as due as the budget shortfall? And looking forward, you said you're still looking to achieve your financial goal for 2019. Are there any other services or anything that you might have to cut if you don't meet that target? Thank you.
I can start. We did make cuts last year, and across all of the fields. Maybe I'll speak about West Bank. We lost 150 staff last year in the West Bank, mostly through we had mobile health centres, and we also had mental health support for the outlying Bedouin communities. We had job creation program that we cut last year, and as a result, we lost 150 people. But we also made other cuts. Like we haven't been able to maintain a lot of our cars. We haven't been able to replace a lot of staffs in order to maintain the budget envelope that we are working in. So there really have been challenges in terms of maintaining those services, and we are seeing an increase. What we're concerned about if there are future cuts is that we saved 92 million last year in addition to all of the work that we did to raise resources. That was our contribution to the crisis that we were facing. A lot of those efficiencies are obviously still in place, but it will be really a challenge now to reduce or cut any more without reducing the services. And I think that's really what we're concerned about moving forward. We can stay within the budget of 1.2 billion, but if we had to cut more, we would probably have to cut into our basic services.
Just Gaza-specific additions are, we too had to separate from some staff, about 116. Significantly, we had to move a huge number of colleagues, more than 500, from full-time work to part-time work, and that included 300 mental health counselors. Now, I described to you earlier how arguably mental health needs are growing. So it's been painful to, in a situation where mental health needs are growing, we've had to reduce the capacity to deal with those. That's been a particularly painful one. While we've been successful to protect the food security operation, there have been these kinds of cuts. Now, Gwyn also mentioned, both of you, that we had 92 million worth of savings. That's been shown itself in, for example, higher class size averages. You know, if you don't replace teachers who go on retirement, there is pressure on the class size averages. Before, when I started, class size averages in Gaza were below 40 at the end of 2017. They are now 41 and rising. That's a consequence of not being able to have your budget grow with demands. Looking forward, at this point, two main concerns. One is the food security operation. We've been stating very publicly that we need $60 million to maintain the continuity of that. That's part of the 1.2 million budget. $60 million we need as a minimum to guarantee the continuity of the food security operation for 1 million people in Gaza. And then linked to the other services like education, one worry we always have is whether we have enough money to open the new school year. We just finished the current school year. We are now in summer break. End of August, I think in both West Bank and Gaza, schools are due to open. Right now, strictly financially speaking, we don't have the money to guarantee the opening of those schools. Now, that's right now. We have a couple of weeks to go. We have this pledging conference, as we call it, coming up. So we hope, and that's one reason why we're conducting news conferences like this, that member states and others will not let us get down to the wire again like last year, and that we can open schools on time.
I think we have two left, one here and then there, so please.
Hi, I'm Carol Landry with AFP, Agence France Presse. A few questions about the pledging conference. How much money are you hoping to raise on June 25th? How many countries do you expect to turn up and at what level? And can you comment how you see the donor community at this juncture? Do you see fatigue? You can describe the situation. Also, going ahead, do you expect the U.S. to challenge the mandate renewal for UNRWA at the General Assembly?
Okay, first on the pledging conference, the figure we set is $1.2 billion for the year. We're not. I think it's a very dangerous practice to try and set a specific target for any one moment in time, given the fact that each country has its own bureaucratic procedures as to how its fiscal year works, when it can commit to money, etc. What I can tell you is that I wouldn't call the atmosphere one of fatigue. I would say, however, we are all conscious of the fact of how many demands there are globally on the humanitarian and development resources of all of these countries. We are aware that even within the region we operate in, we are not alone. You have Syria, you have Yemen, you have Libya. There is a situation where there are many demands. That said, what we saw last year in both political support and financial support, we are certainly continuing to see at this point in the political support. I mentioned the statements at the Security Council, but our discussions right now with the primary donors are very positive. Now, between that, we all know, and actually having someone show up and commit to a certain figure remains to be seen. We are hopeful that by June 25th, not necessarily we will have all of the money in the bank, but that we will have additional funding plus very clear indications from countries as to what will be coming between now and the end of the year. Because one of the things that was extremely difficult about last year was having to operate on a sort of month-to-month basis as we struggled through our financial crisis last year. We have avoided that up to this year, and we would like, as I think all of the member states would like us to be pursuing a solid management approach that includes, good planning, execution in advance of budgets, and all of that. So what we hope to get out of the pledging conference is additional funding. I can't put a specific figure on that, but also very clear indication of what lies ahead for us. The other question on the mandate renewal, which UNRWA's mandate is renewed every 3 years by the General Assembly, and it will be up for renewal in November and December at the General Assembly this year. We have no indication at this point that the United States intends to seek any changes. I would point out that the last renewal was 167 votes yes, 1 no, and 9 abstentions. So I think it would be a very tall order to seek significant changes to that. I think we have time for one last question, please.
Thank you. Excuse me. George Baumgarten, correspondent for Jewish newspapers in North America and other assorted media as far afield as Kazakhstan. How do you respond to the criticism that your textbooks specifically are written and published in such a way as to incite hostility toward Israel, are very critical of Israel? And what are you doing? And I know this has been a problem in the past, and I'm not saying you're doing it deliberately. What are you doing to see to it that the authorities, the Hamas authorities in Gaza, don't keep putting, small weapons and things like that on the roofs of your buildings, which tends to make those targets of those buildings. Thank you.
We have, well, the first thing to say is the textbooks we use in any of our schools are not our textbooks. They are the textbooks of the host authority. In Lebanon, we use the textbooks published by the Ministry of Education. In Gaza, we use the textbooks published by the PA, not Hamas textbooks, the PA textbooks, Palestinian Authority. Thank you, Peter. So that's the first thing to say. Secondly, there is an intense discussion between donors to the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian Authority about the content of the textbooks. And I think it's fair to say that over the last few years, the textbooks have significantly improved around the concerns that you have mentioned. Thirdly, we have our own internal process to review new textbooks. And our own education experts say that between 3 to 5% of the pages are here and there problematic. And a lot of that is not around hate, incitement, and violence. It could be issues linked to UN values, including gender. So it's a very small number of pages that are considered problematic by education specialists. Next thing to say is we then have a process in place where we demand of our teachers to be very sensitive to these difficult pages and to ensure that children understand why they are sensitive. So there is a very rigid process. I have personally met with all 274 of our school principals in Gaza over the last few weeks to hit home this particular point, the importance of understanding you are a school principal in a UN-run school, and you must do everything possible to ensure that UN values and principles are transmitted to the children. And you know, I visit the schools regularly. I have no evidence that there are serious issues with our teaching staff in this respect. On your point of weapons, you know, our Commissioner General has said this a number of times very publicly. We did discover in the 2014 war in one of our schools, I believe it was, weapons that were not hidden on the roofs. I can assure you if there were weapons on the roofs, the Israelis would know this very quickly and make it an issue. So yes, there were in one school weapons hidden in a school. When we discovered that, we alerted the authorities, including the Israelis, and we ensured that those weapons were removed from our schools. And we are very determined and committed to doing that whenever an issue like that arises. A comparable issue is tunnels under our schools. We've discovered them in 3 or 4, including one during my time. We ensured that the duty bearers, including Hamas, were immediately notified about this being unacceptable, and we took corrective action in terms of closing those tunnels. And let me finally, if we still have half a minute, read you a small poem from a 15-year-old Palestine refugee. So that's what I was doing when I was fiddling with my iPad here, not reading my email, but trying to find this. 15-year-old Palestine refugee Jamila from an UNRWA school in East Khan Yunis in Gaza. She was named the winner of the 2019 Inspirational Messages of Peace contest by the U.S. National Park Service and International World Peace Rose Gardens. Okay? And this is the result of our education. Her poem is, "As long as we can love, why do we choose to hate? As long as we can make friends and tolerate, then why do we antagonize and debate? Why don't we leave aside malice, animosity, and hate, and search for love inside our hearts before it's too late?" That's the result of our education.
Thank you. Great. Well, thank you very much, Matthias and Jamila, for that. And I'd like to thank all of you so much for coming out to this special event that we had here. We appreciated you being here in large numbers. We hope that you will continue to have an interest in UNRWA. We hope we will have something very concrete to report back to you after our pledging conference on 25th June. We hope that you have a great rest of the day and Eid Mubarak to those of you who practice.